Hello, everyone. Welcome to American Shade and welcome to another installment of Two Perspectives, Let's Talk, where I engage in conversations with individuals who hold polarizing views to better understand each other's stances and to take on the task to see what our ideas are made of. In today's episode, we will focus on racial reconciliation, racelessness versus race identity. I will be in conversation with Dr. Sheena Mason. She's a Howard University graduate where she earned her doctorate in English literature. She has written a book called Decolonizing America's Racist and Racial Imagination, an examination and critique of anti-racist discourse, which will be released in 2022. She has a very extensive and amazing resume, which we'll discuss a little bit more. But one thing she's developed, which will be the center of the conversation today, is a program called the Theory of Racelessness, where she believes in order for Americans to truly reconcile with race, we need to do away with racial categories forever. So before I state my position on this, and before we dive further into the conversation, I want to welcome Dr. Sheena to the show. How are you?
Hi, Brittany. I'm doing so well. I'm so happy to be here with you today. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I'm excited for this. But before we begin, can you tell the viewers a little bit more about yourself, your background, and briefly why you created the theory of racelessness and what inspired it? Also, this will act as your affirmative position on racelessness, and then I'll state my position on race identity.
Okay, so
that's a lot.
Like, where do I start? Yeah, so I just finished my doctorate at Howard University, as you mentioned, and I specialize in African American, American, and Caribbean literature. And those specific bodies of literature are what influenced and inspired my theory of racelessness. It's really the existing literature and the existing discourse that exists that led me down this path. And then I very uncreatively dubbed it the theory of racelessness. My central focus on my dissertation, which is now turned the book project you mentioned, is anti-racism, exploring all of the ways in which using literary studies, African-American literary studies as an example, all of the ways in which people unintentionally uphold racism by upholding race ideology. And so that is at the core of my scholarship and my teaching, and it is at the core of many conversations that I have. I'm primarily concerned with this because the sort of passion for social justice and activism that I have developed since the time I was a child and has persisted into adulthood. And I really believe that it is my life's purpose to do this work. So that is what's ultimately motivating me. And I also have been in the bad habit of silencing myself for fear of being misinterpreted. I think it's too easy to misinterpret any part of what most people say, but especially some ideas that I share. And I'm turning over a new page and saying, hear my voice. Like, even if you do misinterpret, that's on you. But hopefully more people than not will work to really hear me and understand what it is that I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
So my business is an educational consulting business called Theory of Racelessness. And we're focused on helping institutions and organizations, as well as the average person through resources like podcasts, to understand and identify how they are inadvertently upholding racism in their anti-racist efforts. A lot of what we do is educating people on what are called the 6 philosophies of race. So in the field of philosophy, there is a specialization that is philosophy of race, where all types of scholars across time and across spaces have been theorizing about what philosophies of race look like globally, locally, regionally, and so on. And so I came into this knowledge toward the end of my doctoral work when I started going down this path of seeing and identifying what I call the undoing of race to undo racism in literature. And I was connected with a philosopher at Howard University, Dr. Jacoby Carter, who then exposed me to a wealth of information that I think most Americans are not privy to. And those 6 philosophies of race, I'm not sure if you want me to go into those now, Brittany, or if you want me to wait.
Let's wait. Let's wait up,
Okay.
because we're going to get into all of that.
Okay.
Yeah. And I want to preface this discussion by saying that you and I have had a couple of Zoom calls prior to the show, and they were both very lively, to say the least. But because we disagree on so much, but I feel like we agree on the bigger picture of wanting there to be racial reconciliation in this nation, that just solidified for me why this conversation should happen and why it should be public. So there's no champion at the end of this, talk. There's no gold trophy that will be awarded, but the point of this talk is to showcase on a micro level how 2 polarizing positions on race can engage, and hopefully this can be, an example for others to start having honest dialogue and conversations on a very difficult subject in good faith, though. So this is what's going to happen, and I'm excited for it. Now I'm going to state my position, which but let me just thoroughly explain it for the viewers. My position on race identity. And I'm going to actually read from a piece that I wrote in 2020. It's called Our Skin Problem. And medium.com actually featured this last year, and it will be linked in the description box if anyone wants to read it. But this piece, I argued against the notion of a post-racial America. So in a sense, I was arguing against racelessness, though not necessarily because I'm against the reasons behind the notion, but because I believe this notion is actually impossible. And the reason is simply because we all inhabited one inescapable factor, which is our skin. I continue by stating that our skin is cloaked with color, and that color is stained with centuries of racial connotations. Therefore, our skin is not only a pigment, but a pigment that represents racial signifiers. And the tricky thing here is these racial signifiers are legitimized through the perception of society. Therefore, to enjoy a post-racial America, everyone must literally become one pigment, or remove their skin, or die. And unfortunately, these 3 options are more practical than ridding our race problem from the nation. Even though race is literally fictitious, color categories based on our skin, like white or black, have become, in a sense, very intertwined with our biology, like having brown hair or green eyes. Race is seemingly genetic. Whether we like it or not, everyone is confined and will experience a racial experience because the construction of the world will not allow anyone to escape from race. However, the same evidence that showcases the endurance of racial categories inversely proves the implicit biases we attach to them cannot be trusted. And perhaps that's the part Americans can strive to destroy, to judge each other by the content of our character, not the skin. So here I'm explaining a protest for Dr. King's philosophy on not relying on skin color to characterize an individual. And to me, it's not contingent on giving up or erasing one's race identity, which is to say, in my case, I can be a proud Black American and be a proud Black American who chooses to judge people on who they are, not based on their skin tone. And this is something I actively do. This is something that's a big part of what American Shade is all about. Besides being a channel where people come and think, it's also a platform that challenges people to have conversations on race like we are doing right now, and confront this uncomfortable topic and realize there's more to us than skin and race. But there's nothing wrong, in my opinion, with seeing race. It's how you see race is the question. And based upon that answer determines your point of view, determines if that point of view is flawed. So that is my statement, my stance on race identity. And I know you have your own take on that. You're writing notes, I know it. But first, and you can definitely, chime in on that. But first, I want to kind of dive into who you were pre-racelessness, if you will. So what was your upbringing like? Were you around, a diverse community? Were you the only Black person? What was your experience like, and what was your first time experiencing racism?
Yeah, so two of my biological brothers died under suspicious circumstances and were taken away from my biological parents. When I was born a few years later, I was put in foster care, and then I was adopted by the time I turned 1. I was adopted by a woman who immigrated from Panama. So, for all intents and purposes, a woman of color, right? My brother, also through the adoption, is Black. And my adoptive father, is white. Now, I experienced severe abuse and neglect in that household. I moved out of that house on my 16th birthday when I was a junior in high school. Or I was ended my sophomore year, and I was entering my junior year of high school. And I actually chose homelessness over staying in that house, which then subsequently led to me having to drop out of high school my senior year because I was sleeping on park benches. And the adoptive family that I did live with for approximately 15 years, to this day, I'm estranged from them. It's been over a decade. I haven't had any communication with them. And rightfully so, because they have done nothing to earn my presence in their life. The first time I really learned about race, so I grew up in a trailer park, and for all intents and purposes, the community that I grew up in was predominantly white, and with the exception of my family and kids that eventually moved in across the street. I learned about race when I was about 6 or 7 years old. My adoptive mother told me that my adoptive father's family didn't like me because I was Black. Now, she lied. It actually wasn't true. But she did that because she didn't want me to have a relationship with his family because she was abusing me and she didn't want to be discovered. So she said this thing that was extremely hurtful that pointed out what she perceived to be my difference and what most people perceive to be my difference, and then weaponized it and used it against me. And the next time I experienced racism, I was about 9. My brother, who was my brother through adoption, was the same age as me. We were a couple months apart in birth months. He got shot at by a skinhead in the same trailer park that we lived in. Him and our neighborhood friend, who was also racialized as Black, got like literally a gun shot at them, and they ran away. They escaped. I remember my brother came home crying and screaming, and that was a really impactful and traumatizing moment for me because I think it forced me to recognize in some ways even more my mortality, which I was always aware of, unfortunately, because I thought my mother was going to murder me. Like literally, that was the fear I had as a child. And then when I saw that kind of threat of violence and death happen to my brother because of racism, that was an everlasting thing. I could say that the perpetrator of that violence ended up getting kicked out of the trailer park, and he got shipped back to like Tennessee or some state where his father was. So he was never again perpetrating his bigotry against us, at least. And then a couple other kind of random times, like when I was 14 or 15, I was on the school bus, and a new girl in the community was on the school bus, and she started calling me pubic hair. And one day she grabbed me by my hair and she punched my head, like she assaulted me. And so it wasn't just enough to taunt me and really embarrass me in front of high schoolers and middle schoolers that were on the bus. She assaulted me. And then when I got off of the bus that day at the middle school, she had to continue to the high school. She hawked a loogie. I still remember the sound of her hawking a loogie out the bus window, and her spit landed in my hair. At that time, I was like Tracy Ross Ellis. I feel like I always mix up her last names. My hair was really long, and she spit in my hair. I've been called the N-word repeatedly. Like literally from the age of 6 onward, I was very aware of racism, largely because I was aware of race. I became aware of race. And so those experiences, of course, used to have, I think, more power over my psyche because they were traumatizing experiences. Like those were very unpleasant, not fun experiences, especially being a child that was already experiencing constant violence at a place that's supposed to be home. And so the thing that I turned to always was reading and school and music and sports. Those things really saved my life because fortunately, because I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, although my family was poor, the school that I went to was more affluent. So I had access to every book I could have ever wished for. And it was my only escape from my life. And at that time, I actually needed an escape from my life. So I read voraciously. And although I had to drop out of high school my senior year because I didn't have a place to live, like I had bigger fish to fry. I was in AP classes. I was taking college classes. I mean, I always was getting A's thinking that that was going to earn the love of my parents, which newsflash, it did not. And I've taken those experiences and what I gained from the education that I immersed myself in with me, of course, into my adulthood. And I wish I could say that things got better as I got older, you know, but they didn't. Like after undergraduate, I was in a different state, part of New York State. I experienced more diversity there than I had growing up, which was, I think, a positive thing. Especially there was a big population of international students. So I really thrived in that environment. Then after undergrad, I moved to New York City. I was in Canarsie, Brooklyn. I was in East New York, Brooklyn. Then I spent most of my time in Jamaica, Queens. And I was then, of course, around a very diverse community, I feel like, but predominantly racialized Black people. Ended up moving to Houston, Texas, and sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just for the viewers, can you explain what you mean by racialized Black people?
Yeah, so racialization is simply the marking out of specific groups to either be the victim of oppression or the victors. So to signify that I am in no way, shape, or form unintentionally, or I guess in my case, it would be intentionally upholding a naturalist view of race, I add the word racialized Black people or racialized white people, or I'll even do so-called, or I'll use air quotes. That's all to signify that at minimum, I'm recognizing race as a social construction as opposed to something biological or of nature. So then I lived in Houston, Texas. That was more diverse. Got my master's degree from the University of Houston. Mind you, at my undergraduate institution and when I got my master's, the schools, although the communities were diverse, the schools themselves, I still found myself surrounded by a lot of racialized white people. So I'm spending a lot of time still arguing about the existence of racism and class and things like that. And I said, you know what?
When you say racialized white people, do you mean liberal?
No, I mean racialized, just as there are, to be white is to be racialized, to be Black is to be racialized.
Oh, I see.
So racialized is again, just signifying that I'm not conceding to the essence of race, right? So spent a lot of time arguing about the existence of racism in both spaces, which was, as you can imagine, a very frustrating thing because I wanted to have deeper conversations about it. I didn't want to argue about something that I took as 100% factual, like I was over it. Went to California. I was in the Bay Area. I was working in San Jose, very diverse. I was a general manager for 24 Hour Fitness. I managed a team of almost 100 employees, very diverse. And in that space, I ended up being part of an offshoot of Black Lives Matter. It was specifically for people who identified as queer. I'm a lesbian. I'm also queer. And so I was part of that group, organizing, doing my activism, all of those things while waiting to go to Howard University to get my doctorate. And I wanted to go to an HBCU because I did hope that at an HBCU, at least I'm not going to be arguing about the existence of racism, you know. And my saying in California with the folks that I organized with was, you know, when Black people are liberated, all people are liberated. So coming to an HBCU for me was really crucial because I was coming with that mindset and with this idea that I was going to find home in this predominantly racialized Black space. And so that ultimately motivated me to go to Howard. And then I must have romanticized the experience because sure enough, at an HBCU, HBCUs are still part of American society, still part of this world, right? People are still people wherever you are. Mm-hmm. And so I experienced an unfortunate amount of ostracization. I don't know if it was because I was like out and proud. I don't know if it was because I was like really hardcore super about my scholarship. I mean, I didn't just graduate from Howard. I passed with distinction, which is an honor reserved for less than 1% of humanities degrees worldwide. And my advisors told me that they hadn't actually had a student pass with distinction. So I was really about that life, which can make you unlikable in most spaces, like even at the PWIs, you know, I was always the student who I was just always on it. And that made me different in some ways because of the hardships and the traumas that I went through. I just hold myself to always a high standard, always. And I never make excuses about anything ever, ever. And so, yeah, I think that made me an outsider to a certain extent. But at the end of the day, because of the traumas that I lived, I privileged and prioritized my education, and I wanted to make my education as profound and impactful as I possibly could. And so constantly talking with faculty, constantly reading more and more and more, and writing more and more and more. And so far my mind hasn't let me down, you know, it's brought me to where I am now. Mm-hmm. And I'm happy and proud to say that the faculty made my experience at Howard, really, they saved my experience at Howard. And they showed me what it looks like to not just say that we aren't a monolith, we being racialized Black people, but to actually act in ways that shows an embracement of difference, right? And that to me has been invaluable, will remain invaluable, and is something I hope to carry with me everywhere.
Mm-hmm. So before I ask you about your experience with doing Black activism, you touched briefly on that. I'm just going to give like a brief synopsis of my background to contrast with your experience. I mean, I'm just doing it brief because everyone's heard it by now. So, yeah, I grew up in a white community in Columbus, Indiana, very Republican, conservative. There's about maybe 1,800 to 2,000, maybe Black people here. And there's about 45,000 people that live in Columbus, Indiana. So I was often the only Black girl, Black teen, Black woman, even at work. Like if there was more than 3 Black people in my classes, it was abnormal, actually. So it was relatively normal. But I remember my first encounter and it's hard to say if this is racism because kids will be kids, but my best friend, he was white, and this was first grade. I was like 8 years old. And I remember this is when Spice Girls was huge. And everyone was passing around the CD and they're like, oh, I love her and I love her. I love Baby Spice. I love, and then I pointed to Scary Spice, which is Mel B, the black woman. And I'm like, oh, she's so pretty. I love her hair and everything. And then my friend Derek was like, oh no, she's not pretty. She's the ugliest one. She's ugly. And I'm like, why? And he's like, because she's black. And I'm like, oh. I was like, I'm black. And I think that was my first encounter with realizing there was a difference with not being white. Like I knew I wasn't white, but that's when I realized, okay, there is a difference. And then I look around and I'm like, I'm the only one. I can't really confine it to anyone. Does everyone think black people are ugly? Like that's when I kind of had those thoughts. Then when I really got a lot of, when racism was conceptualized to me in a thorough story by my father who lived under Jim Crow, he told me this story, not to scare me or my brothers or sisters, but I think to kind of get us prepared in a sense with racism. He talked about a moment when he was 8 years old, and I'll just make this long story short. He was at a lake with his father and his brothers. He ventured off, he slipped into the lake, he started drowning. His brothers and father were nowhere to be seen, but there's a group of white men that were like around their truck and they were laughing at my dad. And my dad could hear them laughing and calling him every racial epithet, but he still was asking for their help, like screaming and begging for their help. And they kept laughing at him. And he said, like, as he was fighting for his life, he just couldn't believe he could die because they wouldn't help him. So he told us this story, but my dad never ever told us like, and this is why you hate white people, or this is why white people are evil, never that. But I was sober to racism at a young age. So then when I went through it, and I think that's maybe why my dad told me this story and was pretty, open with these discussions, because we were the only Black kids and in a lot of spaces. So when it happened, it was shocking, but not that shocking, because I'm like, I've heard this before. Like, I know what this is. And yes, I was called the N-word. I was made fun of for my skin. Even my friends, like I said, kids will be kids, but like my friends might say a joke about my hair, right? Or like, oh, your hair's nappy, or oh, your skin looks like this or that. Like, and you laugh along because it's kind of like a survival's mentality. Like you're just laughing just to like still be one of the cool kids or people part of the crowd, and you don't want to be too different. You don't want to act like it bothers you when you go home and you're actually crying about it. But jump to college. No, I did not go to a historically Black college university. I went to IU, not too diverse. And then I went to NYU for grad school. Again, I thought that would be very diverse. No, it wasn't. I was the only Black person in my program with criticism that was focused in journalism. And at IU specifically, again, I was usually the only Black person in class. And that is where I kind of, though, had my breaking with relearning my history, because I realized at around 17, 18, I harbored these colorist ideals of myself. I thought that, I always wanted to be lighter skinned because my mom's light skinned. I thought like, and that was what was in media. That was what was beautiful. That was what was cool. That was when, Beyonce first came out and all of these women, Latina women were out. And I'm like, oh, this is what beauty is. So I remember in the summer, I didn't really like to go out and play in the sun. I didn't like to get darker. I felt like if I get darker, I'm ugly or uglier or whatever. And I remember one day when I was 18, I was going running, and I always ran with a hat and with, an athletic long sleeve shirt if it was really sunny out. And I couldn't find these things one day. And so I didn't run. And then I thought to myself, wait, am I not running because I'm afraid to get darker? I'm like, what is this? Like, why do I feel this way? And then I literally Googled it, found the phrase that it was coined by Alice Walker in, I believe, in the 70s or 80s, then found Toni Morrison, then read The Bluest Eye. Then I'm like, she wrote this for me. Obviously not, but I felt it was it described how I was feeling in such a way where I was like, wow, that was the moment where I started devouring different Black writers, James Baldwin, Gwendolyn Brooks, Alice Walker, Neil Larson, like all of these people, and revisiting like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, civil rights movement, like what they really did, even Harriet Tubman, reading slave narratives, like really trying to gain a sense of what was missing from school, that what they didn't teach us, which was a lot. And I regained this sense of pride within myself with being Black, because I never really had it. But when I learned my history and what we did and what we overcome, I'm like, dang, okay, we're amazing people and we've done amazing things, and there's no reason why I can't thrive. So in the sense of how you feel, there's no excuse. That is how I feel like today, right now. There's no excuse for me. And I guess we'll touch base on ethnic identity and racial identity, but that was kind of my background. Also with my activism, I'm going to ask you about your experience, and I'll be brief again. But yes, I did Black Lives Matter of Columbus, Indiana, 2016 to 2018. And I have said this before with the last conversation I had with Kimmy Katiti. I don't regret doing BLM. I do it again. I do Black Lives Matter of Columbus again. And I talked about this with Brett Weinstein, that there's different phases of BLM. The phase I was in, I believe, was the most authentic stage. And then now I don't really know what's going on. But if that was the BLM then, I would have done it. I would do it again. With my activism now, one might say it's unorthodox, which it is. I still consider what I do now, in a way, Black activism, even if I don't label it that, because I know what I say, and the fact that now I unabashedly just say what I think, and I don't think or second guess, oh, because I'm Black or because I'm a woman or because I'm this or this, I can't say these things because this isn't within that narrative. I say what I believe and what I think makes logical sense and what I took time to vet and critically thought about. Like, I say those ideas. And I know there's so many people who watch American Shade or watch different talks like with Brett Weinstein or Coleman Hughes or Megan Murphy, who will write to me, and these are Black individuals, and say, they'll either say they agree with what I said, or they'll just say, the fact that you said what you said makes me want to be more bold in what I want to say, because you're kind of shattering the binary of what people like you should say, should think. And you're giving me kind of this permission just to literally be who I am. Like, I can be Black and also have these thoughts. And you're kind of showing me that even if I get pushed back or if I get criticized, to do it anyway. And I think that is, in a sense, Black activism, because again, I'm advocating for the fact, like you said, and what you found at Howard, that we're not a monolith. Like, we literally are not. We are so diverse in thought, but because the mainstream pushes one narrative, if you go against that, then you're just not Black. And so that is what I try to destroy every day with my work. Again, though, I am also for, racial reconciliation, and I want unity with everyone in America. That's also a main goal of mine. So it's not just reserved for people that have my skin color. I'm fighting for unifying everyone, in a sense, or whoever can, in a realistic way, not a utopia way where we're all holding hands and eating cotton candy and whatever. Like, that's not going to happen. But in a realistic way, I'm fighting for that unity. And that is because, and we'll get into this more, but I have this outlook and this optimism, cynical a little bit. Yeah, actually cynical optimism. But I have this optimism for America because of the past, because of what my ancestors and what people in the 50s, 60s, 70s were able to accomplish, is why I have this optimism for America as a whole. So that's why, one reason why I'm very passionate about, one, can identify with their race in a way where it's conducive for them to see the future and progress, then to be racialized, how you described it, to work within their racial identity, that's always thinking that because they're the skin color that they're always at a disadvantage. Or they're all like, they wake up and they're like, well, here I am Black again. And now I'm gonna face this barrier. Now I have to, when I wake up, I never am like, here, gotta face racism. Never. I'm like, how am I gonna thrive today? Like, I don't even, it's because of my skin that I think I can do anything. So that's a long thing about my activism, but very curious about why you got into Black activism and how. Also, can you tell us in a sense how it made you feel? Because this was pre-racelessness. So how did you feel when you were doing this work? I love we take notes. We're like, let us write down.
Listen, otherwise, just like in an interview, you can go off on so many tangents and not even answer the question. So I try to take notes and avoid that as best I can. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first, Brittany, I want to thank you so much for sharing part of your story with me. Of course, you know that I am a fan. I'm a consumer of your videos. So I've heard different parts of your stories at different times. Mm-hmm. But I think it's definitely different when I'm talking face to face, right? For all intents and purposes. So thank you for sharing. And a lot of what you said really resonates with me. So one thing I will say is that I wouldn't call my activism Black activism because again, I'm intentionally working on not inadvertently upholding racism. So I would just remove the racialization there and say activism. Why?
I meant like, you said you did Black activism during Howard, yeah?
Black Lives Matter before Howard.
Oh, before. Yeah. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So why activism in general? This really started for me as an undergraduate. When I started school, I was thinking I was going to go into psychology. And my whole thing at that time was I felt like my life's purpose was to help people. And as a young person, I was trying to figure out what the helping people looks like. And I had to believe that because otherwise I would have interpreted it as I went through all that I went through for no reason. And so when I started undergrad, I was thinking how I was going to help people and sort of use my mess as a message would be through psychology, that I was always going to get a PhD and I was going to be probably at like a high school or something like that. And I was going to work with youth. That was my idea. After about a year, I was doing just fine with that track, was excited about it, but something was pulling me toward literature. And I should have known going into undergrad that that was going to be the path that I was going to take because of my constant and persistent love of literature. I read voraciously again for as long as I can remember. I mean, I started reading adult books by the time I'm 10. I should have known. Something clicked about a year into undergrad, and I said, you know what? I don't know where this path is going to take me, but based on what I know about myself, this is the path that I need to take. And from the very beginning, I was primarily interested in a lover of all literature. I even TA'd for a Chaucerian literature and Arthurian legend, like medieval literature. But I was primarily interested in African-American literature. So they partnered me up with the African-Americanists at the institution. I ended up doing an advanced honors thesis. It was like a fancy way of saying I did a 100-page paper as an undergraduate focusing just on African-American literature. And those efforts that focus on the literature are reflective of my activism always, because I always approach African-American literature as if one of its central purposes is activism, right? Because like how the body of literature has come to be defined in academia and by the average person is largely as having to do with race and racism. And so I was so drawn to the literature for all of those reasons. And it gave me a space where I could explore different ideas and where I could feel like I was a part of activism, that I was witnessing activism in the very act of writing and reading something. And then also as the scholar, in quotation marks, of the literature, that my activism would come through and the publications that I would later produce, the conferences that I would later produce, the knowledge that I produced. So my activism really started with that. And that's what drew me and still draws me to literature. So by the time I was in California, also 2016, I was still operating from that mindset of like, ever the activist, ever about social justice. And Brittany, probably a lot of why my heart is so invested in this work is because of the atrocious things I survived and overcame as a child. You know, I think that those experiences really prompted me to be that much more invested in the right thing happening, right? That much more invested in the struggle, to really use my hurt and the traumas that I lived for the better. And I especially was interested in helping young people. That's something I've stayed with, because before 2016, when I was working with BLM, I was in Houston, Texas. I did Teach for America. So I'm a Teach for America Corps member. I taught at what was called a Last Chance charter school. And I worked really only with racialized Black and brown students who didn't even have a library in their school, had security guards and wands and gates. It was more like a prison than a school. Again, with the idea that I can use my experiences as activism and I can educate, and that process is activism too, and a necessary part, because I really attribute my life's trajectory to the fact that I was able to get the education that I got and make my education what I did by just reading all the time. Not everyone is afforded that luxury, you know, and I recognize that. I recognize that as a privilege, that despite the fact that I had the life that I had, I was very privileged by having all of that access to books and things like that. So yeah, I think that's primarily what has kept me motivated and driven me. And when I was working with BLM, and it was 2016, San Francisco Bay Area, I was thinking about all of the little Sheenas in the world. You know, I was thinking about my own self as a child and thinking about how I deserved so much more than I got. Full stop. Like I deserved so much more than I got, that although I had the privilege of having access to books and stuff like that, that did not erase the fact that I lived every day thinking my mother was going to kill me. It didn't change the fact that my father was complicit because he was a corrections officer. He worked all the time. He literally just ignored the abuse and let it happen. There's only one time where he ever put his foot down and said something to my adoptive mother. And then my adopted brother ends up turning into an abuser by the time we're 14, 15, to the time I moved out at 16. He started abusing me too. He like picked up where our adoptive mother left off. And I really felt like I deserved so much more. So the idea that there are people in this country, in the world, but let's focus on the United States, right? One step at a time.
Yeah.
In this country, who have less access to opportunities, to what I call power, because of how racism operates in this country, that grinds my gears, like that grinds my gears. That is something that I will always resist so long as I have to. And ever searching for more efficient and effective ways to do this activism, that necessitated for me a constant questioning of my own ideas. The things that I took for granted in 2016, and even really all the way up until 2019, even up until 6 months ago, Brittany, like I was saying the same things that a lot of people, I would dare say most people say when it comes to this type of activism, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, the language that you're using, Black activism, Black thought, that was all me. And I only very recently, in my very recent history, came to see something else being communicated to me through the literature and through how things play out in society. And I couldn't ignore it. And I wanted to actually, let's be honest, I wanted to ignore it because something you said earlier that stuck with me that I wanted to make sure to circle back to, it was something to the effect of erasing one's race or identity, racial identity, that is something you don't think has to happen in order for racial reconciliation. When I started going down this path intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally, I felt precisely the same way. And I said precisely the same things. And I sat in my mentor's office, bless her heart, crying over the ideas that were coming to me, the stuff that I was seeing in the literature that nobody was talking about, cried over it because
just to preface, I said race identity, not racial identity.
Yeah, I wrote down erasing one's race identity.
Okay, cool.
But then grammatically, I changed it to racial because that made more sense.
Okay. Okay, continue.
I'm sorry,
continue.
It's the English literature.
Yeah.
So
I did literature too, minor.
I sat in her office crying over my ideas, saying how I didn't want to be the person to do this, to feel this way, to argue these things. And I didn't want to do it to myself. I didn't want to not claim Blackness, if you will. I didn't want to not claim race. And it took me 2 more years until probably within the last 6 to 8 months to finally unlock something in my mind that was preventing me from understanding even my own ideas. And the thing that I had to unlock was that in talking about philosophies of race and talking about racelessness, which is a philosophy of race, which is ironic if you think about it, I am not arguing for the erasure of anything. Nothing actually gets erased except the violence of racism. That's the funny thing about it. So I kind of chuckle when I say it, because I think it's hard for most people to understand and recognize that at first when presented with my ideas, because I didn't even recognize it myself until very recently. Nothing gets erased except the violence of racism, which I think is something that both of us would agree would be a good and beneficial thing. And not in a utopic way. I love that you said that earlier. Not in a utopic way, like we're all singing Kumbaya and everything is fine and perfect and nobody is ever racist. That's not the goal. That would be really nice. I mean, I think that would actually be a really nice thing. But when I talk about eliminating race, I'm talking about eliminating racism. And that is the thing that we can do, that I believe that we must do. And that is the only thing that gets erased. The pride, the honoring and learning of our history, the feelings of connectedness with each other, if it exists, All of those things remain, even if racism isn't part of the equation anymore. And if we need racism to continue to operate in order to feel those things, the pride and the connection and the unity and all of that, then that's a deeper, different discussion and question and soul searching that we would each have to do individually. Because I still myself concluded that actually it would be better to remove the violence than for me to cling to what I perceive to be my Blackness, and let me work to find other language to describe myself, the thing that's been categorized as Blackness. Because like you've said countless times before, there's nothing wrong with being Black, right? This is about race. This is about racialization. This is about acknowledging and recognizing the fact that to be racialized is to be within a hierarchy. Full stop. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's a hierarchy that's attached to race because of how race was created in the first place. And so if that's the case, then the goal, to my mind, should logically be to eliminate race, to eliminate racism in as much as we can. I think we can get to the statistical majority of policy, organizations, institutions, people being against racism and also by extension not racist. I think we can get to that. It's just a statistical majority. I think we can get to that. But then the question is how?
How? Yes. You said a lot there, and it touches back on a conversation that we had the first time we talked. First, I want to preface something, because you said that your life experiences is a big reason why, if not the reason why, you do this work now. And with me, it's funny. My life experiences, yes, with having relationships with people from different backgrounds, from race to politics to et cetera, growing up in Indiana or going to New York, and being since 8 years old to being 32. But I think the main reason why I can do what I do now, and I'm open to hearing different point of views and having these conversations with people that I might not align with on ideas, but I still want to learn about why they think the way they think, especially with race, is my prior addiction to alcohol. And the fact that, and I won't get into it too much, but yeah, I suffered abuse too during that time. But during that time, what I needed the most is what I got. And I don't know if you said you're Christian or not, I can't remember, but so I'm not here preaching to anyone, but for me, I needed patience. Like, I needed God to be patient with me, and he gave me that. He gave me mercy. He gave me grace. And in a sense, I think he's showing me, and actually I know he's showing me, that I gave you all that grace. I loved you through the ugliness, through the worst times you were, to where you believed you were unlovable, to where you were a horrible human being. And I loved you anyways through it, saved you anyways through it. That you need to, if you can give that iota of patience to other people, to people that I also died for on the cross for, and that type of, and I hate to use the word grace because I don't want to create a hierarchy of I'm giving people grace. No, but in conversations that I have with people, that if they do say something that might be offensive, or they do say something that might be, if anyone else heard it, they might react. Because we're in this dialogue in good faith, I just sit in it, and because I know, like, just to be patient, wait, like, think about what they're saying, let them get it out. And that is why I can do American Shade. Like, those experiences is why. So I want to preface that. But
I love it, Brittany. I love it.
And I know you've heard this before.
I am Christian.
Yeah, and I know.
Yeah.
I thought, I'm like, I'm pretty sure she said that,
Yes.
but yeah.
Everything you said resonates with me for so many reasons. Yes, I'm with you.
Yeah, and so that's a big reason why I do this and why I can. It is because of God. But I know on our first call, I believe it was our first call that we had, and I was talking about the differences between racial identity and ethnic identity, and that I operate within an ethnic one, and I'll get into that after your answer. And you said, you know, you used to sound like me, and you used to be someone that used to be proud to be Black. When you heard me express how I do take pride in my lineage and my heritage, and being Black within my ethnic sense, how did you feel when you heard me, I guess, mirror what you used to believe?
Brittany, so the conversations we've had, I always find myself laughing and giggling. And I don't know, my mind does this. It might seem like I'm laughing at inappropriate times, but I find humor in like everything.
That's exactly what I said to you last time. I was like, if I'm laughing, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at the things.
So the reason why I'm laughing is because I obviously know my own ideas very deeply because I am me, right? Mm-hmm. So there's that. And we've had conversations, but we're still getting to know each other and our ideas. And so you frequently say things that indicate to me that we have more talking to do, because so many times, like more often than not, I find myself thinking and saying, like, we are not actually disagreeing. Not that there's anything wrong with disagreement. Of course, that can be a good and healthy thing sometimes, right? We don't want to all be thinking alike. And there might be a couple things here or there, minor points that you might say that I would be like, oh, I don't agree, but that's neither here nor there. The things that you just said that I chuckled at is like, so it was something about ethnically being proud to be Black, right? So separating Blackness from race and ethnicity. Okay, fine. That I used to be proud to be Black, and I used to talk in similar ways and say the same things and like think those ways. There is no used to be. That's the part that's making me giggle. There is no used to be. That's the part that I think is too easy to miss from what I'm saying. And I think it's hard to cognitively figure out the labyrinth of some of my ideas, because I'm still proud to be, in quotation marks, Black. That didn't erase, that didn't fall away, that didn't disappear. It's something that I still hold to be true. But the thing is, I just don't call it, or I don't conceive of it as being Black or Blackness, especially not in a racial sense. And if I were to talk about my Blackness interpretation in an ethnic sense, then I would default to African American. Like, that's the term that I would use, right? And so, and I'm looking for better terminology in terms of how to describe certain populations and things like that, because I know that even the term African American is still conceived of as a racial group, but I mean something much more specific. And I think that we need language, we being Americans, we need better language to talk about different populations of Americans. But I say that just to highlight and underscore the fact that you and I are still the same in that way, but the only difference is I don't call it Blackness, period. And the reason I don't call it Blackness is because I identify racism as masquerading as race. And so long as that's the case, which it always will be, because racism causes race, not the other way around, then to take the term, which was created and conceived of by enslavers, to take that term and then just say, oh, but I mean it as an ethnic thing or a cultural thing, it still carries with it the weight of the racism hiding in race. So for me, I don't have all of the answers yet, Brittany.
Mm-hmm.
If I unlock things, like I'm sure I'll be, more infamous than than I am. But I just know that I'm still searching for myself for better language to describe that thing. And I think the elimination of race to eliminate racism would encourage and really force us to come up with new language. And one thing you and I have talked offline about is this thing of like, well, but Black Americans, right, using your language, Black Americans don't have the privilege of knowing their ethnic, background necessarily. At least most African Americans, or many, right, because of the history of enslavement. Well, I think that we are in a day and age when that is now factually untrue, because we have 5,000 DNA services that can tell you your ethnic makeup if that's something that's really important to you. I've done it for myself. I found it to be kind of valuable. Like, okay, I was able to identify that I am a descendant of an enslaved people. That to me is the most valuable knowledge and insight, because I don't personally feel connected to African culture. And I mean African culture, that's another generic term that I'm trying to get away from. But like the specific ethnic breakdown of where my people descended from, the countries, I don't personally feel connected to those cultures or nations, except for the fact that, okay, my people originated from there. Culture that I participate in now is a sort of amalgamation that I identify as just like American culture. Sometimes I identify certain things as African American culture, but I just think we need new language. I think we need new language to talk about these things, think about these things. And at minimum, I think that we shouldn't use language that has the history that race language has, because whiteness, you and I, we might focus on Blackness because we're racialized as Black, but I think it's too easy to miss the fact that if race is eliminated, whiteness also is eliminated, right? Like that's a big deal. And probably that's the first thing that needs to go. So I think we need new language. I think that I think I need to do a better job of communicating as much as I have to, as clearly as I can, that nothing is erased in simply changing the language or change, how I perceive my blackness has changed and transformed and shifted, but it's still there. Importantly, it's still there.
I see we have a lot of more discussions to have.
We do. We really
because
do.
You still think the way you think. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so I disagree with everything almost. Let me see where I took notes, and there are so many notes I was taking. I am, and you're saying that you're trying to find language to come up with what you're trying to describe in your mind. But what you communicated with me, the fact that I'm saying I'm proud to be a Black American in my ethnic sense, which is history. And actually, let me break that down. Let me break down what I mean. So with racial identity and ethnic identity, I do think a person can operate between these. They can be operating within their racial identity or their ethnic identity. The racial identity is what you touched upon, is what was done without our consent, what was done during American slavery, what stuffed aside Black, because they wanted to stuff us into Black to make sure that that signified being inferior, that signified just not even being a person, that was being a slave. Our ethnic identity as Black Americans is what we did despite our racial identity, that tried to tell us what we were otherwise. That is after the Emancipation Proclamation. I believe that's when our ethnic identity started, with the first Juneteenth, when the first group of freed people, I won't say slaves, freed people commemorated their freedom with Juneteenth. And then moving along, even now, with everything, with our culture, with our history, with what we've been able to do, you know, civil rights bill, the Civil Rights Act. And even now, like having a Black president and all the things we've been able to cultivate despite our racial identity, our ethnic identity, to me, is what drives me to not play victim, to not encounter a racial barrier if it does come my way and think, well, I can't do this because of this or that. I never think I can't do anything because of my race. It's because my ethnic identity that makes me know I can do anything, because the past has shown me that people were able to achieve things that were almost impossible to achieve back then, but they're able to do it. And I have no excuses now. I have so much access, granted access that they gave and sacrificed for, and just access now that they couldn't even fathom, that there is no reason why I can't achieve my goals. So I want to say that. Two, I want to say being Black, and I mean like being Black, someone that identifies as it doesn't at all taint how I think. It doesn't at all have any bearing on what I choose to believe about life. Like it used to, because I was operating within, I believe, my racial identity. I believe probably, I think it was until NYU when I had, and I often call it an identity crisis, so to speak. I had an encounter with a piece that I wrote in grad school, my last semester, about Thomas Chatterton Williams, which I put in I put in one of my articles, Black Free Thought, about that experience and how I criticized him as a person because he claims to be someone that is an ex-Black man and ex-white man. He's Black and he's white, but he says he's not playing the race game anymore. And I critiqued him as a person and not really his argument. Long story short, I was taken to task and I thought everyone was wrong. I thought you all are literally crazy. I'm like, and you all are racist on top of that. How is this possible? But once I realized I was wrong and I took myself to task during and after months, 6 months, a year after I graduated in 2018, none of that was contingent on me erasing my identity. It was me getting my mind together. It was me realizing my vetting system was off. But not at all did I say, well, I can't identify as Black because that's a stumbling block in how I can think. Not at all. That didn't happen. If anything, I have a healthier relationship with being Black than I did before. So I just want to put that out there. But that's the difference between ethnic and racial identity. I think, though, and you touched upon this, you talked about why you developed the theory of racelessness. But for me, I think that it doesn't. Actually, let me ask this question first, because I'm gonna get into what I believe first. But I have to ask this: do you think racism can end?
Yeah. So, Brittany, first, I just want to say that I'm slightly confused because I feel like your response was you started out saying that you disagreed with everything that I said last time I was speaking. Mm-hmm. But then I felt like you were talking about things that I didn't say. And then that confused me because I was like, I want to know for my own information what I said. And maybe this will only come through if we like rewatch the tape. But I would want to know what I said that's indicating to you that any of what you just said is something that I was saying or arguing against. And I also think that we should, I like to proceed with caution before I just outright say that I disagree or even agree with someone, because then it kind of, at least from my view, it kind of is dismissive of everything. And then again, I'm going back to the fact that I feel like everything I said was dismissed, but then you didn't say anything just now that I disagree with. So, and that's really throwing me off, because I'm like, but I would agree with you that I would agree with you. And I literally did agree with you. The stuff that I said was in agreement with what you just said. And I tried to point out how racelessness or eliminativism is something that is understood and misinterpreted as being this thing that's erasing part of somebody's identity. But in actuality, that's not actually what's happening, or what I'm arguing for. Now, there can be other eliminativists who do argue for something that's more nefarious, and I think violent towards people, but that's not actually my perspective or my strategy or what I'm arguing for at all. And in fact, what I'm arguing for is the elimination of racism. That's it. Racism, not somebody's identity, not pride. I'm not arguing for the erasure of ethnicity or one's ethnic affiliation. I'm simply suggesting, hey, I think we should rename it, or we should find other language besides language that is tied to race. And while I can appreciate and see your own trajectory of like, okay, I look at race being this thing, right? But then at some point, Black folks themselves reimagined and reshaped what Black meant into this ethnic thing that is uniquely also American, et cetera, that I call Blackness or that I associate with Black people. Okay, let's say I concede with that point. 100%, I don't disagree with you. I simply am pointing out the fact that and also this is a question that I would love to hear your response to. What is lost by using a different word besides Black or Blackness to describe the ethnic and cultural affiliations that you're talking about? What is lost in making that linguistic shift that gets us more outside of the confines of racism? What is lost?
I think, okay, so I think you misinterpreted my humor, and I know I'm sarcastic. So I'll just give this example. When I said what I had to say about being proud to be Black, which started this whole conversation, in my ethnic sense, and then you made a joke with saying, oh, I see it, we have more talks to do since you just said what you said.
So then you said you disagree with everything in a joking way.
Yeah, I disagree. yeah. It wasn't a literal.
My heart hurt because I was like,
no. I don't necessarily laugh after my jokes because I'm very, it's very sarcastic. So when I said that I disagreed with some of what you said, but
right.
I mean, that's just my humor. Yeah, I'm very cheeky. Yeah.
I'm glad I had the courage to call that out and ask and not walk away feeling like, wow, Brittany really thinks that we disagree about everything and we don't. Because
I prefaced the episode with we disagree on a lot of stuff, but we agree on things. But the thing is, I'm so confused about some stuff with and I'll ask the question again after I answer your question. But with race and identity, I don't agree that racism is necessarily completely attached to race. Like if I'm saying I'm proud Black American, I don't see how racism is hiding behind that. So that's one. Two, to answer your question about what you would call what I feel about being Black, what I would call that, or what would be lost if I came up with a different term, what could you come up with? Because these were Black people who did these things. It's a Black history. And yes, it's American history, but nonetheless, it's been cultivated by Black people, Black Americans. And in a way, when I'm saying that, I'm honoring the past. Like the way I live now and gratefulness of what they did, and to only move forward in progression and not, even if there's something in my way that's very hard to overcome, whether it's on race or whether it's on that I'm a woman or whatever, I still persist over it anyways, or try, because I am reminded, but like look what Malcolm did, but look what Dr. King could do, look what Harriet Tubman can do. And I see my take on being Black and my ethnic pride, so to speak, is personal. Like it's an individual choice. I'm sure many Black Americans wouldn't agree with how I see myself. Some might, some don't. Again, we're not a monolith. We see it differently. So there's that. And there's something else. Oh, here's the example I want to give you. So I don't think that racism, so that is one thing I disagree with. I don't think racism can end. I don't think racism is something that can ever be jettisoned from the earth. I don't think by tearing down race, you're going to get at racism. Racism is a feeling, it's a choice. James Baldwin said that it's a matter of the heart. It is something that people choose to do. It's not something that's hiding, to me, inside of a structure, inside of a racial category. Because there's plenty of, I'm friends with multiple different types of people, and we all operate within our race identity, and we aren't racist towards each other. I know what you mean, that racism thrives. It can thrive in it, because as long as there's boxes and separations, then it lives. I get that idea, but I don't agree with it. And I don't think that is where racism is. The racism is a choice that anyone can make at any time and participate in. And to just give this more clarity, do you think sin can be jettisoned from the earth? Because we're both Christians. I love the
laugh. Well, that's far more complicated, because I would count myself a Christian, but I would say that I'm far more, that cliche saying of like I'm more spiritual than religious and yada yada yada, because I could sit here all day and talk about all the ways in which my identity as a lesbian, right? I'm married to a woman and we have children. All the ways in which people have used the Bible or their interpretation of the Bible, therefore using religion against me. And they would identify my life as quite literally living a sin, right? And so I think sins large and small, I think that that's like so subjective and such a philosophical question that I think
racism is small and big too.
Oh yeah, sure. But sin isn't something I've dedicated decades thinking about and researching, whereas racism is. Do I think that racism can end? Not in the like paradise type of all of a sudden where we are to 0%. No, I don't think it can end in that sense. And I think that people who talk about racism ending in this sort of zero-sum way are perhaps missing the mark in a lot of ways, because I don't think that we can go from where we are to 0%. I just don't. I don't think that's realistic. That would literally require every single human being in America, just in the context of the US, to think the same thing and agree in the same way on a single issue, which, I mean, you take any other issue outside of racism, not every single person is going to agree on the same thing. They're just not, you know? Mm-hmm. So that for me isn't the goal. But I think the term eliminativism, like the philosophical term eliminativism, is misleading, because it almost is like, oh yeah, it can be eliminated. No, I don't think that it can be eliminated completely, but I do believe that it can be lessened so that the statistical majority, that's all we're going. I feel like it's a numbers game, the statistical majority of people. Whereas right now we might identify the majority of people in this country as being racist or having racist ideas or being complacent or whatever. I think we can get to the other side of that, that the statistical majority can shift. I believe that. And what you said earlier about God's role in your life and the role of patience, and you're kind of hesitant to use the word grace. I think that that also is one connection that I feel with you, because I don't like bringing God into conversations for reasons that I probably just sort of inferred, or implied, I should say. But I do believe that this is God's purpose for me, and that God had me go through what I went through, but he gave me, at the time, I was praying for him to save me from all that I was going through by like plucking me out of the situation and putting me in a loving family, like a very naive, childlike, simple request. I just wanted to be saved in that way. And when he didn't save me, I really struggled. But then as I got older, I came to identify that the way that he saved me wasn't what I was hoping for as a child, but it's exactly what I needed. And it was giving me this deep love for education and literature and reading. And that love saved me both in the moment, because I think I would have, like, by the time I was turning 16, I was very suicidal, and I've tried to commit suicide in my lifetime. So I don't know if I would have survived if I hadn't had that starting very young as a child. That was his intervention for me. And then progressing to today, God is the reason why I center love in my life, and why I, through Theory of Racelessness, through my activism, through my work with Freedom Project Network, like everything I do is really coming from a deep place of love for other people. And I do believe that people are more good than they are bad. Again, very subjective, non-academic terms, but I do believe that. And I don't believe that there are these minions running around having all of these racist ideas about other people who I don't think that actually, to a certain extent, I don't think that type of racism matters, in as much as those people are also the people operating the systems and institutions in the country. I think that racism matters. Would I like people to be like what I would consider to be good, decent human beings like Baldwin, and like lead with love truly, and not call people the N-word or otherwise disparage people, not assault racialized Asian people? You know what I'm saying? Like, do I wish that people would be just better human beings? 100%. But from my own perspective, I feel like racism matters and is urgent because of the ways in which systemic racism has manifested itself in society, with a disproportionate number of racialized Black and colored people being impoverished, a disproportionate number of Black people, Black women particularly, dying during childbirth, a disproportionate number of Black and brown people living in food deserts. All of those things, like the things that I was so privileged to actually have access to, like the thing that saved me, literally, those are the things that to me is the travesty of racism, and the reason why racism matters so much to me on a very deep level, because we can as a society change the tides of that. And so when I think about how racism is masquerading as race, yes, I do hear you, and I do understand what you say when you say things such as that identifying as a Black woman actually gives you your power, that you don't perceive anything negative to being Black, right? That you
some really, of my power, right? Like it's not like all of your power, but right. I am Black, and that's just one aspect of me, but that's not all of me. Yes,
but it's an important and profound part of you as you see it. Like, I do understand that, and I think that has value. And this is not Sheena devaluing the value that actually has, because I think that if we look at the history, we see that that is very much a survivalist measure. How racialized Black people have taken Blackness and turned it into this, just like a little fruit fly bothering me, and turned it into this thing that is outside of racism for themselves, first and foremost and primarily. I think that is profound. That is something that I'm not diminishing, that my work doesn't diminish, my ideas don't diminish. I'm not disagreeing that that's the case. I think that it's certainly been a strategy for survival in the best possible ways. You know, I think it was Toni Morrison who once said that Black people should have been annihilated, you know, because of the violence that was inflicted upon them. And the fact that we are still here, not just surviving, but thriving, right? And with all of our beauty and glory, like that is a real thing that I agree with.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that I think is hard, and it was hard for myself to even like really grapple with and understand, and I'm still working through a lot of these ideas, learning every day, sometimes moment to moment, right? But like, the thing is, if we look at how race plays out in society, if we're able to step outside of ourselves, which can be hard to do, and if we're able to do that from a place of love for ourselves, love for our neighbor, it's sounding very biblical right now, I think that we would be able to admit, even if only momentarily, that how race plays out in American society through racism, that is the evidence for racism hiding its face as race. And if we look at the deep, extensive history of how race was created, how at one point it meant one thing, at another point it meant another thing, and then here comes American chattel slavery, and then it started to get codified in white, Black, people of color, free people of color particularly, how that began to be codified, how that began to be institutionalized in the sense that every single person on American soil was taught this language and these ideas through plays, through music, through just conversation, through books, through newspapers, like all of the things. If we look at that history and look at how we've been reconstructing the meaning of race since before America was a country, we would see that while we've made significant progress, after all, African Americans are not enslaved literally and physically in America anymore, then we would come to find that indeed, in a lot of unfortunate and unintentional ways, racism continues to masquerade itself as race. And if that is the case, that to me is the same. And I'll say Barbara and Karen Fields' Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life. For anyone who wants a PDF version of it, like email Brittany, or if my email is going to be in the description box, like hit me up. I have a PDF of it. It's a life-changing book. While I don't agree with everything they say, they make some really significant points. And they talk about this racism, race evasion. But I take it even further to say that racism is race. Racism causes race, not the other way around. The problem isn't race, the problem is racism. And I think in American society, we're talking too much about race all the time, you know, at every turn, we're talking about race and we're racializing ourselves and other people. And what the unfortunate side effect of that is, we're not often talking about the actual problem, which isn't race, it's racism. And if we were to start talking about racism in terms of racism, number one, we would, I think, be more clear-eyed in identifying what racism is and what it isn't, what it's in and what it's not, because the journey I've been going on recently is like acknowledging the fact that racism isn't actually in everything. While last semester, I literally told a class of students racism is in everything. And I've since come to recognize the error of my ways. I think that's actually dangerous to talk like that, because it's also not true. And so, yeah, I think we just become more clear-eyed about what racism is, which will actually then enable us to have more meaningful conversations, because you and I were the anomaly. American Shade, in a lot of ways, is the anomaly. And it needs to be the standard. But I think that the concept of race itself actually prevents more of that from happening. So yeah, if my number one objective is to like be against racism and actually work us closer toward liberation, that to me necessitates the elimination of race concepts and language, and a redirection of the focus toward racism, both figuring out like what it is, how it impacts society. Some of the problems I named earlier as being caused by systemic racism. Also, there's like classism, that's a thing. Socioeconomic status has a lot to do with this conversation. I think that gets missed. So when you remove the thing that's a distraction, which is like race, because race isn't the problem, I think we're better equipped to talk about the actual problems, to identify the actual problems, and then to solve the actual problems. Even if we don't eliminate it race forever, the concept.
Yeah. I want to talk about why I even brought up sin, because I do see racism as sin. And the thing is when sin is something that we were born into, that we didn't necessarily cause in ourselves. If we want to get biblical, which I have to on this point, with Eve eating the fruit caused the rest of us to be sinful. And then we have to, repent for our sins, get saved. And we're not even sinless at that point. We're still sinners, but we, ask God forgiveness, everything. We know the story. It's not Sunday yet when it is, but, so I see that as, what if Christians were like, well, before we can be Christians and before we can really strive and have a relationship with God, we must strive to rid sin out of the world and mandate it, jettison it out of everything before we can become Christians. And that's how I see racism. Like, you don't have to jettison it out of the world when it can't. You can't do that with sin. You can't make all sin go away. Therefore, when it's all gone, then I can serve God. I see with the same with race and racism, I don't see how we can become a raceless society, just because what you pointed out, how old and how race stained this country for centuries. And I think that it is more or less so intertwined with who we are that trying to get rid of it would take another 500-600 years if it could even happen. I mean, I can't even, this is actually part of the last question I want to ask about the solutions of racelessness if it was implemented. So I'm actually going to save this. But I want to say that you say doing away with race is how we can get at racism. For me, I think racial reconciliation starts with people willing to just fundamentally, basically, just critically think, because thinking requires you to wait before you act or respond. It also requires you to have patience, like it demands you to be patient. So if people critically thought about who people are, or about certain topics, or even about national or local racial incidents, that will inevitably open people to operate on logical sensing and not on their implicit biases. And to me, one cannot reconcile with something they are not willing to understand first. So, and I'll say it again, I don't think reconciling with race means negating race out of the picture. I think reconciling with race is more so engaging with what has happened to us, which you've said, and reframing how we see people inside race. I think that is realistic, and I think that has longevity throughout time. So that's my position on it. I think the real crux of the issue is the fact that people just don't think about things. We assume too much, and it is because we see people's skin color and just assume something based on our biases. And this is something I actively try to work on every day when it comes up, when it flares up, if you want to say, because it's not just white people that have implicit biases. Everyone does. I do. Every single person does. But the thing is I actively make sure that when they come up, because they even come up before you even realize they're there, but when they're there in my mind, I take it to task and I vet it and I don't act upon those things. And now more so, it doesn't necessarily come up as much as it used to. And I'll even say this, for example, there's certain circumstances that's happened, certain things that's happened. Just for example, the Olympics with Sha'carri Richardson, I believe her name. And when I was told, because I was in Washington, D.C., I believe, when this happened, this was like 4th of July, something around there. And when I read the story and I was like, dang, like she did weed and she can't, compete. It sucks, but it's like, I wasn't even thinking racism. I wasn't even thinking like, this is white supremacy getting at her. I was thinking, dang it, like she's been through a lot. And I personally really like her and I'm still, hoping for the best for her. And she'll compete, but that's neither here nor there. But I was like, dang, like she's been through a lot and I understand probably why she did it, but man, I wish she didn't do it. And I was more mad at her team, if anything. And then when I saw all the conversation and narratives and even AOC tweeting out that this is racist and I was like, how is this racist? This is literally policy. Like they know that they're going to be tested after they run or before they run. They know that they're not supposed to take enhancement drugs or any type of drugs. This was a decision she made, a choice. And luckily she has taken responsibility for it. And I don't even think that she's been thriving on that narrative of this is white supremacy. It's a narrative around her, but I don't know if she's been thriving on that. But like I said, like that I can clearly see as through logical sensing. This makes sense. Okay, close the computer. It sucks. And I wanted her to compete because she's awesome. But then when I heard other conversations and my friends tweeting me or whoever, and I'm like, you guys have to talk to me about it. And I actually had a discussion with a friend and it got kind of heated. Still love him. But I was like, you have to logically explain to me why this is racist. Like you have to. More or less, it was an anecdotal reason of why this person felt so passionate. But like I said before, like I was able not to operate within falling into the traps of considering everyone at the Olympics, white or whatever they are, as racist. And I operate within my race identity as Black. And I wasn't saying, well, yeah, they're racist. That is what it is because what they did to this other Black. No, I didn't even think about Black. I just thought Olympian drugs. They did that to Lance Armstrong. Like they took away his stuff. So that's what I mean by critically thinking. And it's just something when you start doing it a lot and it just becomes like your go-to, that's just your number one, that's your A plan of everything is to critically think. Sometimes you piss people off because they're like, you don't see what's going on. I'm like, no, you don't see it because you haven't thought about it. You're operating off of a feeling or you're operating off an assumption. And that's not what's happening here. So that's my thoughts on that. I really think it's critically thinking. And you did touch upon, so I know what you're saying about certain racism is something we shouldn't focus on, like interpersonal racism, but you're talking about systemic racism is the thing that is dire to focus on more so. But I asked you this question before because you don't see race, or I want to say see race, you don't believe in white or Black. So you don't believe white supremacy. I'm guessing you it's more race supremacy for you, correct?
That's actually, oh my gosh. So Dr. Carter and I recently co-authored a chapter and he put white supremacy, but he knows, so he's a social constructionist eliminativist. I'm a skeptic eliminativist. So we changed the language from white to race supremacy. I don't see any huge benefit or even a small benefit to differentiating racism from racism from racism. I see white supremacy as being racism. I see anti-Black racism as being racism. I no longer see any real benefit to differentiating between the forms of racism. I think racism is racism.
Okay. So, well, to that, I think white supremacy means so many things where it means nothing. Like when people describe an incident that occurred, like there's better language and more concise terms that people can use besides cloaking it, everything under white supremacy.
Sure.
Things become
I feel that way about Blackness.
Yeah. And we can get into that. But I believe like most people believe white supremacy is like the default of America. America operates on white supremacy. But when you break down the term, supremacy literally means the state or condition of being superior to all others in authority, power, and status. So if you attach white to supremacy, it means the state of condition where white people are superior to all others in authority, power, status. And in America, you could say this is true, and it is true, but it's not the whole truth. And that if America really operated solely on white supremacy, then no Black person or any minority would be in any positions of control or influence. And that's not to say that people are propped up for optics in roles to look good, but I'm saying like people that are like actually have economic wealth, have real influence from like culture to political influence. And it might seem to some people that I'm dismissing or negating the power out of that term, but I'm not. I actually take racism and white supremacy and racial discrimination very seriously. And I'm frustrated when people consider every little thing as white supremacy overshadowing real situations. So for me, when I say like racism can't end, I don't say in a flippant way, like racism can't end to me, yes. And like you, I'm more focused on the racism that's like more ingrained, the things that fundamentally affect minorities and Black people. Interpersonal racism, I often talk about how, like if someone calls me the N-word, this has not happened. I mean, people have called me N-word, but since I've said this, I haven't been called N-word in person. But on an interpersonal level, if someone calls me the N-word and I don't react, to me, they don't get any power from me. Like the power is my reaction. And I believe a writer said this, and I want to say it was Shelby Steele. He said that Black anger flatters white power. Mm-hmm. That if someone calls you the N-word, it's only a word lingering in the air. It means nothing until you react. And it's not to put responsibility completely on the recipient. Like, it's your fault. If you react, it becomes a thing. No, it's more so to reframe it. Like, you have the power, actually. Like, they threw you the only ammo they have. And by you not reacting, you actually disempower them. So yes, there are different types of racism in this world, from the most minute to the most extreme. I'm more focused on the extreme, the day-to-day things that even I get on the internet. I don't care. Not to say I don't care, because I don't want to act like, oh, I don't care. But ever since BLM, I've been called out on my name. So it's something I know that happens when you're in the public eye and you're talking about race. I mean, I know it's going to happen, and these people don't know me. So I take it under the chin. But so, yeah, so you call it race supremacy and you don't separate it with like, oh, it's white race supremacy, because you believe race is the supremacy. Just so people understand.
It's definitely ironic, because if I So this was a chapter that we co-authored for an Oxford Handbook on Art and Ethics that's coming out by Oxford University Press. And it's specifically focusing on the Harlem Renaissance. Now, if it was a single authored chapter, Dr. Carter's going to get a chuckle out of this. I wouldn't have put any supremacy thing. I would have just put racism. I wouldn't have put race supremacy. It only ended up being that because it was a term that he wanted to use at the time. And I respect and honor and value the fact that he views race as a social construction, whereas I am skeptic about it, right? And so we use that language. But as we're talking about it, for me, yes, the term race supremacy is redundant and sort of unnecessarily so. I could almost even shorten it just to supremacy, but I think the word race does that in and of itself, at least in my own work, because I am pointing to the fact that with race, because racism is race and race is racism, that there's a hierarchy, that there is some form of supremacy that's operating in how race plays out in society and in how people conceive of race. And from my standpoint, I agree with you that racism can't end completely. We do agree there. But I also would say that racism can't even end in part so long as we continue to uphold and promote and privilege race ideology. Why? Well, because we've been reconstructing it since before America was a country. And maybe in part two, I can open the floor with like actually defining the philosophies that I mentioned earlier, because it's not something we've talked about yet. But the most common default position in America tends to be this one of reconstruction. And we've been literally reconstructing race since before it was a country. That's centuries long of reconstructing it. So to me, it is partially a question of practicality. I mean, I think the sort of cheeky definition of insanity is doing the same thing more than once and expecting a different result. I don't think that we can ever get to a place where our reconstruction efforts will pay off in the ways that we would want or hope, which again isn't the complete elimination of the problem, but just like a lessening of the problem, if you will. I don't see how we get there if we continue to try to reconstruct. I think it's time to be more radical and revolutionary in our thinking. Sometimes people say revolution, radical, dirty words. I'm not fearful of using those words. I recognize my ideas as indeed being radical and revolutionary. And hopefully everyone who's listening can see that and recognize it for what it is. This is not a case of colorblindness or anything of that matter. What I'm saying is 100% radical. We need to eliminate race because that's eliminating racism. And not to the, oh, racism doesn't exist at all thing. No, I don't think that is possible or practical, or even, I don't even think that should be the goal. I do think that we can get to a statistical majority. We can shift that so that more than half of the country is what we could identify as anti-racist, and that shift would then become reflected in our policies and our institutions and so on and so forth. And then we'd have a lot more work to do still, focusing primarily on socioeconomic status to actually make the changes that you and I are talking about. Because one thing that Coleman Hughes, John McWhorter, I keep forgetting if it's John McWhorter or McWhorton. I always want to change his last name. Glenn Lowry. One thing that they talk about often is this, in misnaming the problem, kind of as you just said, and kind of this indiscriminate labeling of everything as racist or about white supremacy at work, we then unintentionally avoid solving the actual problem. And the example that Coleman Hughes gave that I felt like was very persuasive was in instances of affirmative action at institutes of higher learning. If we look at their data to see who are they admitting that qualify or identify themselves as racialized people of color or Black people, that those people tend to be immigrants or children of immigrants. They're middle class, they're upper class. So that policy is supposed to be solving for racism, but poor racialized Black people are still poor racialized Black people. Not all Black people are poor. Let's make that clear, right? Not all Black people are poor, but there are a disproportionate number of us who are in underserved communities. And so I think it's like a twofold thing where I don't want to idealize the ending of racism, because actually some of the really biggest problems that keep me awake at night, that I really work intensely to try to solve for in some small way, involves socioeconomic status. Mm-hmm. And kind of like what you said, it's like, it's almost too easy to point to something and be like, oh, racism. And then it's almost like what's implied is it's only racism and it's nothing else. So with Sha'carri, I was so rooting for her. I saw her last race when she qualified for the Olympics, and I was like, oh my God, yes. And I was living for the orange hair.
Yeah. I love it all.
I love her.
I love it all.
And when that all unfolded, and to your point, when I saw the reaction, I was really questioning, is it racism though? Like, is it? I mean, to your point, if they could test any person. Maybe that's the problem. People feel like she shouldn't have been tested in the first place, right?
Yeah, everyone was tested. Now, if they just tested her, heck yeah. I mean,
but they tested everyone?
Yeah, they tested everyone, yeah.
Oh.
If it was just her, then yeah. I mean, you have a huge case on why that is racist.
Right.
But if it is every single person, because I made sure that was the case, and it is. Okay. They tested everyone.
Well, see, there you go. But as soon as you identify something or some happening as racist or white supremacy or whatever language you want to apply to it, it's almost the end of the conversation, right? Like, why does it seem like in popular discourse, as soon as somebody's identified as being racist, a Karen or a Ken, right? It's like, oh, you're racist. And then that's the end of nothing happens after that. Like, the person gets fired. They go off lurking in the shadows. They crawl back under the rock that they've been living under. I don't know. They continue to be racist, but maybe they just don't make sure they don't go viral with it. And like, what's actually solved with the Sha'carri incident? Again, what's actually solved by the pointing to and labeling it as racism? What's solved? It really serves to, I think you mentioned this at the start, so I feel like we're coming 360 now. You mentioned the sort of mainstream narrative. I'm searching for the exact term that you used, but it was something to that effect of like, the mainstream narrative is X, Y, and Z. And in these cases, the mainstream narrative is this pointing to racism, the patting, oneself on the back for being so liberal and so progressive and so on the right side of things, right? Because we convince ourselves that all conservatives are racist. It's like, to me, it's a farce, and it actually does more damage and more harm than good, and it's not solving the actual problems, because we're not even naming the problems. And it only, to me, it really only, not only, but it does serve to further divide people. And that those divisions are along perceived racial lines. That is a thing. And the people who benefit the most from that continued perpetuated division, which has been really at the start since, I would say, especially after Emancipation Reconstruction era, that division primarily serves the very, very, very small percentage of people who have the most economic and political power in this country. So the people it's supposedly benefiting, it being racism, supposedly it's benefiting white people. We have white privilege and all this other stuff. Mm. But like, make no mistake about it, the average racialized white person doesn't actually get the benefit that people profess them to actually have. And if they were to open their eyes and actually realize that, they would also vote differently. They would talk about these problems differently. They would feel differently about these problems. And that to me is one of the biggest and most significant downfalls of using race language or the concept of race or race ideology in efforts to actually do anti-racist work. Because as soon as race is present in something, I mean, I don't know if you've heard All Lives Matter, but that's a response to Black Lives Matter. Why? Maybe because the people who are saying all lives matter are racist. Maybe they have racist ideas. But I would say it's actually way more complicated than that. That when race is present in the discourse and in our efforts to actually end racism, people have been programmed to actually not see themselves in a race that is not described as their own. So people don't see themselves in blackness and Black if they're not racialized as Black or Black being a part of Blackness. And that is a problem. That is a barrier. Because for those people who have a hard time seeing through the smoke, how can you come to the table with those same people and have a meaningful generative conversation about racism when they're not even able to see the problem, because all they're seeing is race and all they're seeing is difference and all they're seeing is presumed differences too. Let's be clear, race does homogenize people in American imaginations. You and I might not fall victim to that, but the majority of people, or maybe just a lot too many people, race homogenizes groups of people. So one thing that I also want to encourage is, like, even if you or I or any person watching doesn't fall victim, I hate using that word nowadays, but doesn't fall victim to that kind of thinking. For the average American, race absolutely homogenizes, washes over differences, and is created and imagined to be such that the hierarchy is arguably always present and always there. And we teach people race. We teach them the bias. That doesn't just magically come because somebody sees pale skin or they see darker skin. We teach people the bias. How do we teach them? Because we teach them race. And how do we teach them race in this country? That's a more complex conversation for definitely another day. But
I want to interject.
Yes.
You said that we reconstruct race and we've done it for centuries or years, decades. Would you argue it's because it can't, well, I know you wouldn't argue it. I guess I would argue it is because it can't be negated. Like, race cannot be negated. One, and two, I don't know if we teach race. To me, I see it as we are, okay, I see your point with why would we want to operate in the very thing that separated us? That, exactly, yes, I get that. The thing is the thing happened. It stained us. It did its job in a sense by separating us by color. But the thing that we can do, which Dr. King strived for, because he wasn't striving for a raceless society, he was striving for a society that inevitably operates on race, and for us to do our duty as individuals and as a whole to see people for their character, not their skin, because he knew inevitably you're going to see their skin. Implicit biases are going to pop up, but it's your job not to be lazy and rely on those, but to get to know people and rely on their character. And if you get to know their character and you think they suck and you don't like them, then you can hate them because of their character, but don't hate them just because they're white or Black or Asian or etc. And so that is where I am, that school of thought I'm in. I see it as, yeah, race did separate us, but it's here to stay. In the same sense as I say, yeah, Eve bit that apple and she, created this whole issue, but sin is here and it's here to stay. And it's up to me whether or not I decide to serve God and to hope to have an eternal life. I can't be like, but God, it's not my fault. Eve bit the apple, dude. Like, it's not me. Like, I didn't create this sin. She did. It doesn't matter. What's done is done. And same with race. It doesn't matter the fact that we're separate. It matters on how we now reframe and refashion how we treat each other, despite the fact that we are separated in these categories. And that, to me, I feel it's, I don't want to say pointless, but I want to say we can spend our time more on focusing on implicit biases and changing that and destroying that in a realistic way than trying to tear down a structure that has been here long before we have, that's been here for 500 years or more. That one isn't bad. It just depends on how you operate on it and in it and see people through it. Like, I can connect with so many different people because of their different cultures, because of the race they're inside. And I can appreciate their different cultures and I can appreciate who they are. So I don't at all even really, it depends on how you see race. Race obviously can carry racism, but race can carry a sense of realizing what has happened and reconciling with that and deciding that I'm not going to fall victim to just thinking that Brittany is Black and that's all there is to her. And what I think Black is all that she is. Like, it takes an individual choice for this. And we've talked for, I don't know how long it's been. It's been a while, and I don't brush off what you say. So I want to make sure that's clear to you and to everyone else. I don't think, well, I think the way I think and she's wrong. No, I have conversations about what we talk about. And I even tell my friends, like, she makes perfect sense on this thing. And I say, and it's weird because the language she uses to describe the thing, it's like we agree with the thing, but we're using different ways to describe how we feel about it. So, and I'm almost thinking then what's the point? Like, if we both want, in a sense, the same thing, which is for people to judge people on their character, then, and I do that. And I would say the reason why I can have this conversation with you and other people and why I have this platform, and I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but maybe one reason why you reached out is because you saw an openness or maybe a peak of hope of openness that maybe this person in good faith will hear me out. And especially because I'm Black. And it was because of, what the story that you had, in your background, your resume, and like how earnest you were, that when I read the email, it was like, I completely agree with this. And now I was like, I disagree with this, but this is something that might be fruitful for other people to see. And then when we had our discussions, even though they got whatever lively in a fun way, I would say, I was like, but this is something I want to do. Because at the net of it all, and I know Black, I know you're not Black. You don't, I'm just saying this in context of the article I have. The Free Black Thought piece that I have, I champion all Black voices, even the voices that don't agree with me, even the voices that don't assign themselves to Black, but that are physically someone that I believe is in my community. I know you don't subscribe to that. I'm just saying. So that's one reason why, a major reason why I wanted to do this with you. Because I think what you're saying, and the more we talk about certain things that I was confused about, it makes sense, right? But like I said in the piece that I have with our skin problem, I think because I have brown skin, because you have light brown skin, because someone has white skin or whoever, that is where race is. Like, race is in the skin. When someone sees me, they don't see, oh, she's a brown girl. No, my brown skin signifies I'm a Black person. Your brown skin signifies you're Black, no matter if you don't subscribe to it or not. If someone said that, and of course this isn't you because you would never do this, everyone, so I'm just using an example. If someone said, oh, someone shoplifted at CVS and she had a curly afro, light skin, Black shirt, whatever, headphones, you probably weren't wearing those headphones, but whatever, they aren't going to ask you if you subscribe to being Black, that you are Black to them. They're going to, if they see you and they're going to take you into questioning, they're like, she has a Black shirt, she has curly hair, she's Black, there we go. Society treats and legitimizes race for us. Like, even if today I decide not to be Black, out in the world I am. So it's like it's a losing war. It's a losing battle. And it's not even a battle I find necessary. I find it that, okay, we're Black, we're white, they did this thing, it sucks. You know what? It's unfortunate that this even had to happen, but it happened. And now what are we going to do? And that's the same way as I see sin. I see it like, it sucks. We weren't there, BC when all this was, but you know what? This is what life is now. We have to choose who we serve. So what are we going to do? Because God doesn't care that we didn't bite no apple. He gave us what we need to do to serve him. And it's plain as day. And you can choose or not choose. It's your choice. And the same with participating with racial reconciliation. It's people's choice at the end of the day. I hope people would want that, but there's people that don't want it. They don't care. So that is why I am for race identity. It's not like I'm for it, like I'm tethered, like, no, I want everyone to be separated, or I want everyone to be white and Black. We're in our boxes. No, I just see it as an inevitable reality that's not going to change. But the thing we can change is our minds. And the way we can change our minds is critically thinking of how we see someone. That when I see someone white or Black or Asian or Middle Eastern, that whatever pops in my mind that is an assumption of who they are, and I have never even spoken to them, and it's disparaging on their character, which I don't even know yet, that is on me to change. That is what I can change. I can do that. And Jordan Peterson said, I can clean my room. I can do that. People can do that. They can clean up how they think about other people. And that is how you can really get to a realistic way of getting racism as close on the edge of this nation's mindset on how we operate and treat each other. Even though it'll never fall off the cliff, it'll still be around. But if we do that actively, which takes work every day, I think that is where we get rid of racism. I don't think me not identifying with being Black, which is something that it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter if I decide to identify as Black. That is how the world sees me. That's how I'm described. When I was born, they checked Black. They didn't check, well, we'll wait until she decides. No, they check Black because I am. And there's nothing wrong with being Black. There's nothing wrong with being white. There's nothing wrong with being Asian. There's nothing wrong with being Middle Eastern or Native American. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. If anything, I'm intrigued with all of these different types of people. And that can be a leeway in getting to know who they are, is to start with that. So that is how I feel about it. And I want to ask this question, but man, we have part 2, everyone. There's going to be part 2 on her podcast. We'll talk about that later. I'm going to ask it anyway, because I got to. There's a couple of questions. So, and I say this respectfully, if your answer isn't an absolute yes, racelessness is the way to get rid of racism, period. And again, respectfully, I ask, then what's the point of aiming toward a raceless society if the end game isn't, well, this theory is going to help us rid racism, people? If that's not the end game and you're like, well, we can push it out as much as possible, that's exactly what I'm saying as well. So I guess why aim for racelessness? Why aim for that for America?
So for me, we already are raceless, which makes it the realistic path to go, because we already are raceless. And that's the thing that we've been focusing primarily on the eliminativist aspect of my thinking and my philosophy. But the skepticism aspect is something that I'm sure we'll talk about next time in part 2. And that is the thing that more people should, I feel like, be educated on. Because as a skeptic, that means that I acknowledge and can concede and see I have a mind that operates, that some people think that race is a social construction, right? Dr. Carter, my mentor, included, that race is a social construction. And also some people think that it is of nature, so they're naturalists in that way. Even though it's been disproven and it hasn't been proven yet to be of nature, that's how some people think. I am a skeptic. I take the third and final position in terms of what I think race is. And because I see racism masquerading as race in society, in that way, for me, race does not exist. People just think it exists. But the thing that people point to as race, as I've tried to, like, we've barely scratched the surface, but as I've tried to indicate through this talk, is like everything else except race. And if we were able to like unlock something in ourselves to really see that, then we would recognize that indeed we are raceless, and that the thing that's operating nefariously and causing violence on us is racism through race. And so the idea that this can't be negated just because it's been in existence for so long, in terms of human history, 4 or 5 centuries is actually a very short time. And if we look at other spaces, we would find that race is relative, and that therefore racism is relative. Race and racism, they don't operate the same place everywhere. Americans, I think we like to tell that story over and over and over again, that white supremacy is everywhere, that racism is everywhere, that anti-Black racism is everywhere, which again, I feel like is the same as racism, is the same as white supremacy. We convince ourselves that it's global. But if we actually analyze other societies, even in different decades or different centuries, Africa before colonization, we would see that people might be racialized in these other spaces, but that racialization looks and feels and operates and is different. So if that's the case, then I think we should give ourselves more credit and consider the very real possibility that more people would be easily persuaded to recognize society, to recognize human beings as being raceless. That in that recognition, again, nothing is actually erased except the idea of race, which inadvertently upholds racism. And I mean, not for nothing, we already have people who are persuaded in colorblindness. We have people like Angela Davis, Jane Elliott, who talk about there's one race, the human race. We have countless African Americans, some of which you've named a few times, which made me smile. Toni Morrison, Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X at the end of his life before he was assassinated. All of these people at different points in their careers and in their writings point to skepticism or constructionism and eliminativism. And the reason why we so far haven't negated racism, which is my word, I'll spell it. It's RACE parentheses ism parentheses, right? I make it one word. The reason why we haven't negated that thing isn't because we can't or because we're so far entrenched or whatever. It's because the people like myself who have voiced alternative methods and strategies of resistance, strategies for liberation, all of that have been continuously marginalized, excluded, silenced. Texts have gone out of print for decades and decades and decades, probably a lot more than we've even recovered fairly recently, like since the 90s. Those parts of their teachings, the people I just named, aren't talked about, aren't taught, aren't emphasized, aren't underscored if it is in print. The thing that's always promoted with all of the figures I mentioned is this race pride, this idea of indeed Black and Blackness, because we're talking primarily about racialized Black people. And that is not a coincidence. That part of their thinking isn't squashed or swept under the rug because they're crazy, because it's impossible. It's swept under the rug because it is absolutely dangerous toward really everyone on the spectrum of like race thinking, if you will, race ideology. Their ideas are perceived as dangerous, not because it would actually cause more problems than it would solve, but because the way of life that we have continued to prioritize and privilege and prefer, and I'm talking about all people, Brittany, people who look all different types of ways are included in this assertion. We haven't been willing to let go of the same thing that we're fighting against. We haven't been willing to do it. And people since the 1800s, African Americans, Elaine Locke, Hurston, very early in her career and then again late in her career, have said and criticized and questioned and critiqued this idea of race pride, regardless of what race you're from. This idea that what connects people is their skin color, which I think you're right. A lot of people, that's what they equate race to, was like how a person looks, their phenotype. And that's precisely the problem, because race is not biological. It doesn't exist biologically. And if it's culture and ethnicity we're talking about, then we should be clear to rename it, reconsider the language and how we describe it, to talk about those things and stop using the language that continues to separate us today, continues to keep us divided. It's very unintentional. People are very well intentioned. And that's why I try to, for fear of sounding patronizing, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying I extend grace to myself and I try to extend grace to other people. Mm-hmm. I think that that's a necessary part of this process, right? Mm-hmm. The reason why these conversations are, I think, necessary and important is there are a lot of reasons, but although we agree on, I think, really fundamental things and fundamental aspects and ideas, but we disagree with the sort of final strategy, if you will, I'll put that in air quotes, for how to overcome these obstacles or certain problems in society. The reason it's important is because the strategy that keeps getting promoted and that the positionality that you currently hold is the same strategy that we're taught from young children to hold. And it hasn't worked yet. We've
I
made
would
progress.
disagree. I would
We've,
disagree. This
well,
isn't my this what how I think about myself now is not how I was brought up. Like, let's just say in school of how I was supposed to see myself or in society. This was intentional and active way of untangling myself from what of how I used to think about myself, of how I was supposed to be as a Black person. This is
I'm just
not at
talking about
all.
the reconstruction part, the idea that we can reconstruct race to be something that's less nefarious, but still operate within our racial or race identities. That idea is something that countless people before us in this country have held, and countless people today continue to hold. And so it's not a new strategy, right? Like, we've continued to try to do that. And you brought up critical thinking, which I think is essential for so many reasons, like beyond racism, right? That is essential too. That is also part of the consistent strategy, is like, oh, if we get the education piece of people better, then that will go a long way toward the end goal. And I think that's true. But I think it's also true that people should be educated and exposed to this information that America writ large continues to keep hidden from us, from them. And we should really, I would want people to really question and wonder about and research, why is it that this information is being hidden from us? Because listen, I'm not one for conspiracy theories. Actually, I kind of am. But to me, it's not an accident. It's not accidental. We are meant to feel like we are always having to operate within race. And the unfortunate outcome of that is the persistence and continuation of racism, which is why I am very vocal about my ideas at this point, even for fear of being misinterpreted or people like really strongly disagreeing with me, which you've been very respectful and kind and open. But it's like, I see the history of how it's happened to countless African Americans before me and plenty of other people too. And that is why this conversation is essential, because maybe not everyone, you don't have to be a skeptic to agree with the eliminativist portion. And you can be a reconstructionist and be an eliminativist. You could, because essentially that is a form of reconstruction if we're trying to reconstruct it out of how we define ourselves in a lot of ways. And so, like, the other philosophies of race, for very important reasons, I think more people should be exposed to, and then they can, of course, decide for themselves. But one need not be a skeptic to see the value of eliminativism. And also, I think it's true that one need not be a skeptic or an eliminativist to benefit from momentarily adopting those positionalities after a bit of education and information. Because even if we just adopt those positionalities temporarily, especially the skepticism part, I've literally led hundreds of people through learning to where, because they were able to step outside of themselves, their own very strong beliefs in Reconstruction primarily, they were able to have better and more productive conversations. And they were able to think more critically, because they, even just if it was in the space of the class or the workshop, they were able to separate the category that they apply to themselves or that society applies to them, because there's two ways that we are racialized. And in that removal, racialized white people were better equipped and able and empowered to not feel defensive about the thing that's being talked about, right? And racialized Black people or other racialized people of color were better able to also have a more in-depth conversation, by even if that came through not applying whiteness to the classmate that's right next to them. It's like, I can't even begin to tell you the value that that has had on people. And I've witnessed it and I've led it. And it wasn't even, I didn't even go into teaching or go into this work with that at the forefront of my mind. At the forefront of my mind was just like social justice, you know, like that's what it was. And I found that as a strategy, that works. And if they leave the class or the workshop and they're right back to their reconstructionist views, which is the, again, I think it's the default, it's the most common position for Americans, that's fine. But they have literally all expressed how transformative the opportunity was and how it got them to think 100% differently about racism and race in the most positive and generative ways. And I think that that's all, like that should not be, whether we agree or disagree on the strategies, just as a strategy for helping healing and helping more deeper learning and helping people really actually think more critically. I think it's something that we would do well to consider adopting in more spaces where we really want to make change. Because
yeah,
so that's what I think.
so I want to touch back on because I did, when we had our discussion, you know, off on in Zoom, I did find it interesting that we both, you know, love the same authors and writers like James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Dr. King, Malcolm X. And interesting enough, I think that we both see their writings, their philosophies, their thoughts as proponents for our positions on this polarizing topic.
It's hilarious.
And, yeah. I would say, though, that, I mean, of course, well, this is what I would say. With Toni Morrison is particularly, you know, she had no problems claiming that she was a Black writer and claiming Blackness and being proud of that. There was a Guardian article that came out, and I believe this is like a week or so after she died, that was, you know, a synopsis of her work, and it had a lot of her own quotes in it. And it said, most writers claim to loathe labels, but Morrison has always welcomed the term Black writer. She said, I'm writing for Black people, Morrison says, in the same way that Tolstoy was not writing for me. I don't have to apologize or consider myself limited because I don't write about white people, which is absolutely not true. There are lots of white people in my books. The point is not having a white critic to sit on your shoulder to prove it. So I think that Toni Morrison definitely was someone who also found like being Black as a sense of having pride in that, but that just being just a part of her. It wasn't all of her. Like she was a lot of other things besides just being Black. And I would say the same for James Baldwin. He said that I am what time, circumstance, history have made of me, certainly, but I am also much, much more than that. I feel like that's like the essence of how I feel about myself. And I believe, again, and we see this in numerous examples in his work, essays, books, of him also being a proud Black American, but also, like you said, fighting racism with love. And this is more so, a perfect example of this is in his letter to his nephew. When he tells his nephew, look, you're Black, you're a Black boy now, but when you're older, you're not going to be a cute Black boy anymore. Like you're going to be like seen as a threat to this country because you're a Black man. And he tells him everything he's going to face. Doesn't hold back. But at the end, he does say that you need to love them, and not love in a way where it's for them. It's a love of like, love them so they feel guilt and shame for even wanting you to be their Negro at all. So that is where I'm operating from. Like, I'm not wanting people to know, you got to see race, you got to see my race before you can get to know me. No. Like, it's just a reality that's true to me. But at the end of the day, I am looking at your character. At the end of the day, I hope you look at my character. At the end of the day, I'm utilizing patience, love, mercy, and I'm hoping you give that back to me because I'm flawed as well. But that's where I'm operating on. Love is colorless, yes, but we are not. Love is raceless, but we are not raceless. And with Dr. King, and this was a speech that he gave towards the end of his life. One would say he became a little bit more radical after he met Malcolm X, and this was kind of during that time. Not too radical, but but he gave a speech, and at the end of it, he was talking about how the term Black and how he said it's been couched in negative language and imagery. And he went on to say that I'm Black and beautiful, and that Black is beautiful. And they lied when they said otherwise about us. So again, another person who's proud to be who he is, proud of his history and lineage, proud in this ethnic sense of being a Black American, because I do believe Black American is an ethnicity. Because again, we are not African. And I have done the DNA test or the ancestry. I know I'm Cameroon. I know that I'm Nigerian. I know I even have Asian in me. I'm Scandinavian too. Like all of these things I know I am, but I don't have a relationship with that history. I don't have a relationship with going there and being like, going to Nigeria and be like, guys, I'm, from the, I don't know. They don't know me. Like, that's not my culture. That's not part of who I really am. That's a part of my DNA, but that's not part of who I am. Being a Black American is a part of who I am, the good, the bad, the ugly. But for me, I make an individual choice to utilize it as a power to thrive and to not use it as an excuse for anything in my life. So there's so many things I want to get into. We've been talking for 3 hours. I do want to say this. 2 examples, and then I'm going to ask you about the solution of racelessness. But and this was in the first hour we were talking about, so I hope you remember this because it stuck with me and I forgot it and it just came back. So I want to say, you said that on something we disagreed with, you're like, you're not taking away the pride I feel about myself by taking away race. That race doesn't take away the pride. Race takes away the racism. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So the pride though, and how I feel about being a Black American, and even if we don't call it Black, that pride was cultivated by people through their identity. Like that wasn't just something that people, like that pride isn't just a human pride or an American pride. It is a Black pride. It's something that was cultivated despite what they were going through. That Dr. King and them fought against the racial identity that was assigned to them to be considered American, to get the rights, to get all of this stuff that I get to access today. That is Black pride. That isn't white pride. That isn't American. That's Black. Because they were doing something in protest of their racial identity that was telling them they don't deserve rights. And they attained it through knowing that being Black does not mean I am not American. Being Black, I am American. We've been here. I am so American. So that is something that I'm confused about on what else would you call it? Because you asked what term I could use instead. And there is no synonym that could be exchanged for that. Like, I don't even see, and I'm not saying that to be combative. I'm literally thinking while you're talking, I was just like, I don't see what else you could call that besides Black pride. And not Black pride like supremacy, not Black pride like we're better than anyone else, but just like, dang, we did that. Just a pride in a sense of they try to get us down. They try to make us feel like this. They try to make us feel comfortable with being 3/5 a person. They try to make us feel comfortable with just getting the scraps. And we defiantly said no because of who we are. And we didn't allow, like, we are brown and they're white, so they deserve more than us. No, we're like, it don't matter if we're brown. We're Black American, like, give us our, and we got it. That's Black pride. So I mean, I guess we can answer this in part 2. I don't know, but that's something that came to my mind. There is no other word for it. And I don't think it should be reframed or refashioned. I think by doing that, it doesn't honor the past at all. By calling it something else, negates the fight that they were against, which was definitely race-based, which was definitely racism, which was white supremacy, because they weren't white. That's why they went through it, because they were Black, because they were brown. So that pride is cultivated through the cracks of that, of the negativity of how society saw them as Black people. And they said, no, we're beautiful because we are. And being Black does not make us, does not negate any beauty out of us, like Dr. King was saying. So that's how I feel about that. Wanted to say that before I forgot it. Also, last thing, I think we talked about this in their Zoom call. The musician, David, forgot his last name, a Black musician who has befriended like over 200-300 Ku Klux Klanners. He has definitely showcased some, I don't even want to say a micro level. I think what he does that's amazing. Couldn't do it. But he doesn't go into those spaces. And I saw him talk at NYU with one of the former Ku Klux Klanner that he helped reform with his friendship and love. But he didn't come in saying, I'm not Black. I'm just here, for the, he was, again, unabashedly a Black man, Black musician. And if anything, that is how they left, because the fact that they created a group to hate people that look like him, but here is a Black man that's coming into their space who is defiantly loving them anyways. It made no sense to them. Why do I hate a people or this man when only he's giving me love? Am I off? What am I not seeing? And that's how 200 to 300 people left. Wasn't because, I don't know if they would leave if he's like, no, I'm not. And I'm not being condescending when I say this, but he wasn't operating without his identity. He wasn't saying, I'm not a Black man. I'm just a man and I'm just here. No, that was in their face. The fact that he's Black, he came in there Black. He didn't code switch. He was him. He didn't put on a Ku Klux Klan get up and was like, well, I'll just cover myself to make you guys comfortable. No, he came in there as David and made them see him there, made them see a Black man there. And that shifted their mind. And it was actually race that reconciled them to stop hating people based on it. So while I agree that definitely you can't have racism without race, but also I feel like we can't reconcile it without confronting race and changing how we see it. And that will lessen racism. We'll not get rid of it at all, but that's a way to get us to really understand that what was done to us and what categorized us in this whole hierarchy isn't real. You're not better than me because of your color, and I'm not less than because of mine. That is where we have to do our business and get our minds wrapped around. Wanted to say that before I forgot. But and you can definitely respond. But I'm gonna end with this, and I gotta choose wisely because I had like 4 questions about the solution, which we'll get into. I'm sure you have your solutions prepared for part 2. But this is a 2-part question. What is the first step someone needs to do if they want to start their journey within the theory of racelessness? If someone decided, I want to do this, what will they have to do? Like the first thing. And also, is there a final step to this theory? There's a lot there, I know. Take your time.
Okay. So yeah, I too, when I hear people using the same authors that I call on in my scholarship and study very extensively to support their points about, particularly about Reconstruction, not so much social construction versus skepticism, but definitely the Reconstruction versus eliminativism aspect of it. Because Toni Morrison also, not so famously, or maybe famously, hopefully some people have heard the other quotes or extensive writings and interviews on this, but she talks about how whatever the phrase of my imagination, the keeper whose keys tinkled always in earshot was race. And she talks about that as a negative. She talks about how always and forever she's defined as a Black writer. She's asked questions about Blackness and race and racism and all these things, and about her writings and how her writings extend so far beyond the bounds of that. It might include that, but it also is like all of these other interesting things and topics that she would have liked to then ask questions about. She says things like, if I were to take away your race and there you are all strung out, who are you? Are you a kind person? Are you still smart? Are you funny? Who are you without racism? Which again is evidence that she sees race and racism as being not just interconnected, but probably the same thing.
Oh, I remember that. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And then
but she was saying that about a white people. She was saying that about white supremacy.
She was saying it to a white interviewer, but why would that only apply to white people, not anyone else? Because the rest of the quote is, then there's this thing about being Black, which is to be a victim. I am not a victim. I refuse to be a victim. So the entire quote actually really problematizes race all around. But she recognized, make no mistake about what I'm saying, she recognized that race is a social construction. And she certainly was, like most people, in conflating race with culture in a lot of ways. So she recognized that there's a Black culture, right? And she uplifted it. And at the same time, that did not prevent her, it was not mutually exclusive, preventing her from having eliminativist philosophies, even if only partial, because as a human being, she was constantly evolving, thinking about things. She experimented removing race from her writings. And that wasn't accidental. She really explored these ideas across time. And the part that gets uplifted about Morrison the most is her social constructionism, which is often mistaken for naturalism, which is often mistaken for conservationism. But what about all of the rest of her? Like we could cherry pick quotes, each proving our own points, but that would just go to show that she was a much more complex thinker. Yeah. And part of how people get canonized, this is like a literature problem, but part of how people get canonized in American society is the sort of, ironically, the elimination of all of these other ideas that problematize the status quo. And the same is true for our friend Baldwin. You know, the letter to his nephew is poignant, and I have ideas about that, but not right now because it's been a long time and I don't remember it completely offhand enough to talk intelligently about it. But his On Being White and Other Lies, he talks about how people of European descent come to America and they have to choose whiteness. and people who are not Black before coming to the United States, we choose Blackness. And that it is something that is ascribed to us, to each person, both white people and Black people and everyone else in between, right? And it's something that we choose. And in that way, he aligns with thinkers like Frantz Fanon, who talks about how Black people choose Blackness, which is not, in his mind, always and only positive thing. So I say this just to say, I am here for, in all of the ways, and I stand for people who complicate the binary in ways that American Shade works to complicate the binary. Because there are binary ways of thinking and viewing and talking, especially about African Americans, that I feel are hugely problematic because it really limits the scope of how people think and what they think at any given time. And it privileges just the parts that we prefer or that we agree with. And also, I'll say Morrison's or Baldwin's or any Kings, any of their feelings of pride in terms of what they attach to Blackness, again, that's a point that I'll happily concede. And I'll just point out that it still didn't prevent them from looking toward elimination as a potential solution, even if they didn't use the word elimination, right? But that didn't.
Is it elimination or unity?
I think it's both. I think it's both. And I write extensively about all of these figures, and especially Morrison. Like, I'll probably write a book and have it published about just Morrison's work, this other side of her work that gets, people don't know what to do with it. And because they don't know what to do with it, they don't really talk about it, right? But there is this whole other side.
But I agree with what you're saying. And I understand, like, people cherry pick people all the time to suit their narrative. And I'm definitely not doing that, because everything you said and every quote you chose to say, I agree with, because exactly what she was saying, that she had a sense of pride, but she wasn't a victim. It's exactly what I said. I'm not a victim. I have a sense of pride the way Tony did, and I'm not a victim at all. And I wasn't trying to be combative with that quote, because I remember, because Toni Morrison is someone who changed my life with writing. Toni Morrison is why I changed my major to writing, creative writing, when I was at IU, because I was majoring in something totally different. And after reading Bluest Eye, I'm like, well, I know what I want to do. Like, not that I knew what I wanted to do, but I knew I had the courage to do it because of her and because of the age that she was when it was published. I'm like, okay, it's not too late for me. I can do this. And so she gave me that boost. I love her. I did my thesis on Bluest Eye and focused it on color hierarchy and colorism. I gave a talk about Toni Morrison at this MOLIS conference, and MOLIS is an acronym that stands for Multi-Ethnic Literature of the United States, and it was in Charleston, South Carolina. And I submitted my thesis into this conference, and they normally just have like people that have like PhDs to give speeches. But because I attached one of my professors on, and she had a PhD, they accepted my thing. And I was able to give a speech there about Toni Morrison. So I love her. She's very complex. She's not one-sided. I think that if she was here, she'd be like, girls. No, I'm kidding. But no, I know what you're talking about her utilizing or taking out race to prove a point, because there is a short story that she wrote. And it's called, I think it's called like Recitative or something like that. But she describes two women from them as girls until they're adults. And
recitative.
Yes, thank you.
It's not the French pronunciation, but that's like my American way of saying it.
Yeah, I'm like, this word is leaving me. But yeah. And yeah, like, so, she did say that she described the characters as one being salt, like shade of, like salt, and one had pepper, pepper skin, whatever. So just saying like there's a white and black character in it. But what she was doing, which was smart, which was intentional, of course, is she never said which one was black or white. She never said which girl was black or white. And she gave characteristics of each girl's personality, their upbringing, that was very subjective. That was almost like, well, she could be black, she could be white, or am I actually assuming she's black because of my bias against what black is or what white is? So I would say that she wasn't like, I think what she was doing was less about being raceless, and it was more about looking at character, like getting to know these people's character, and that color doesn't matter. It's the character. And that's exactly what I say, that at the end of the day, race is here to stay, but it's the character of people. These characters that she made, she wanted people to pay attention to that. And at the end of it, I remember in an interview, they said, will you ever, and she never will, God rest her soul, love her. But she said she would never say which character was white or black. Like she would never say what she thought in her mind, because that's not the point of the story. And she wishes people would not focus on that, focus on the character. So yes, she's very complex, and with, and I don't, and we can literally do 6 hours on Baldwin and Thorson.
Sorry.
But I think at the end of the day, they more or less are proponents for what we're proponents for. We're just disagreeing on what we call it, I guess. But like, I see it like you see it as racelessness, and I see it as them talking about a unified nation, despite whatever race anyone is. But that we are racist, but who cares? Like, we're more than race. We're more than that. We're more complicated than that. And so I don't want to hinge everything like, no, Sheena, like you have to care about race. It's not that. I just see it as I see race. If you can see it the way I see it, I see race as skin. I see it as like, I mean, one could bleach their skin. I never will, but I can't get rid of brown. I can't get rid of black. And I don't want to. And the way I operate in it is conducive for what I'm doing on American Shade, is conducive with how I interact with people. But I get what you're saying. Again, I do. I get it. Like it's nothing to where I don't think at all where it's like, oh, no, because I wouldn't have had 3 conversations with you. Like, I think that what you're saying, like, obviously you're intelligent, and I'm so intrigued by people's thoughts that don't align with me. But you're thorough about what you believe. Like,
wait until you read my book.
I'll hopefully I buy it and then I can get it signed. Like, so
yeah, I'll send you a copy actually.
Yes, I'll read it. Thank you so much for tuning in to American Shade. Make sure you tune in for part 2. This conversation is not over. It's going to be taking place next Friday on July 23rd. And on July 19th, on Monday, there's going to be a panel discussion. There's going to be 8 panelists, including Sheena and myself. And we're going to talk way more about racelessness, race identity, and what racial reconciliation can look like in America. We're going to really dive deep. We're going to talk about solutions. We're going to talk about everything. So we're just getting started. No holds bars, more to come. Look for everything in the description box. Everything will be linked. Thank you so much for tuning in. Peace, love, less shade.